haven't done a video in a while, but this subject seems like a great one to come back into video content on. For those of you who aren't aware, there's been some very interesting things going on in the Christian culture these past few weeks. A couple weeks ago, the author and purity culture advocate Joshua Harris, a pastor, announced that he has lost his faith. And just a few days ago, the very famous and prominent singer and songwriter Marty Sampson announced that he too had also lost his faith. And I wanted to go over their statements. I'll read them out in full here and go over my thoughts, because there are some interesting observations and there are some dangers lurking here where people are feeling emotions. They're feeling cognitive dissonance. They realize that they were wrong about something, but because they can't quite articulate what it is that's wrong, or at least it seems that way to me. Don't want to put words in people's mouths, but it looks like there's some confusion in expressing these points, and because they can't quite convey it properly, even to themselves, they end up going down that they assume that something follows from their deconversion that actually does not. So let me begin by Joshua Harris's post. Now, interestingly enough, he announced that he had lost his faith just a few days, if memory serves, after he announced that he was getting a divorce with his wife as well, which looked amicable on the surface. Who knows what it's like behind the scenes? So Joshua Harris writes on Instagram, "My heart is full of gratitude. I wish you could see all the messages people sent me after the announcement of my divorce. They are expressions of love, though they are saddened or even strongly disapprove of the decision. I am learning that no group has the market cornered on grace. This week I've received grace from Christians, atheists, evangelicals, ex-evangelicals, straight people, LGBTQ people, and everyone in between. Of course, there have also been strong words of rebuke from religious people. While not always pleasant, I know they are seeking to love me. There have also been spiteful, hateful comments that angered and hurt me. The information that was left out of our announcement is that I have undergone a massive shift in regard to my faith in Jesus. The popular phrase for this is deconstruction. The biblical phrase is falling away. By all the measurements that I have for defining a Christian, I am not a Christian." As an aside, I love his precision there. Anyways, continuing. "Many people tell me that there is a different way to practice faith, and I want to remain open to this, but I'm not there now. Martin Luther said that the entire life of believers should be repentance. There's beauty in that sentiment, regardless of your view of God. I have lived in repentance for the last several years, repenting of my self-righteousness, my fear-based approach to life, the teaching of my books, my views of women in the church, and my approach to parenting, to name a few. But I specifically want to add to this list now. To the LGBTQ plus community, I want to say that I am sorry for the views that I taught in my books and as a pastor regarding sexuality. I regret standing against marriage equality, for not affirming you and your place in the church, and for any ways that my writing and speaking contributed to a culture of exclusion and bigotry. I hope that you can forgive me. To my Christian friends, I am grateful for your prayers. Don't take it personally if I don't immediately return calls. I can't join in your mourning. I don't view this moment negatively. I feel very much alive and awake and surprisingly hopeful. I believe with my sister Julian that, quote, all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well, end quote." That was on July 26th. So now let's go to Marty Sampson's, much shorter, I promise you, little comment here. He says, and this is just a couple days ago, "Time for some real talk. I'm genuinely losing my faith, and it doesn't bother me. Like, what bothers me now is nothing. I am so happy now, so at peace with the world. It's crazy. This is a soapbox moment, so here I go. How many preachers fall? Many. No one talks about it. How many miracles happen? Not many. No one talks about it. Why is the Bible full of contradictions? No one talks about it. How can God be love yet send 4 billion people to a place, all because they don't believe? No one talks about it. Christians can be the most judgmental people on the planet. They can also be some of the most beautiful and loving. But it's not for me. I am not in anymore. I want genuine truth, not the I just believe it kind of truth. Science keeps piercing the truth of every religion. Lots of things help people change their lives, not just one version of God. Got so much more to say, but for me, I'm keeping it real. Unfollow if you want. I've never been about living my life for others. All I know is what's true to me right now, and Christianity just seems to me like another religion at this point. I could go on, but I won't. Love and forgive, absolutely. Be kind, absolutely. Be generous and do good to others, absolutely. Some things are good no matter what you believe. Let the rain fall, the sun will come up tomorrow. End quote. Now, it is interesting that two pastors, a pastor and a very, very prominent worship leader and singer, should depart the faith so, back to back here. But this is not a new phenomenon. I think everyone knows this. One of the early people I became familiar with when I departed from Christianity in high school was another fallen pastor who wrote a book called Faithless, and it's actually, I should look up the title here. It was by Robert. It was another fallen pastor, and he had a very interesting story. I'll have to find it at another point. He had a funny story there where he was describing hearing the voice of God telling him to go down a particular road. And so he went down that road. He followed that voice. And he went down this road, and the voice told him to park. And he parked, and he waited. And he waited. And he waited for like 2 hours or something insane like that. And the voice didn't come back to him. He didn't hear any more. And after a while, he realized that wasn't God's voice at all. That was my own head saying this. This was my mind coming up with these impulses, and I was ascribing God's agency to that internal voice. And that resonated with me tremendously at the time. Anyways, so that was a pastor 15 years ago. Maybe not quite that long. Dan Barker was his name, by the way. 10, 15 years ago, yeah. Losing faith. And back when I was more involved in the atheist world, there's an entire community of pastors who had lost their faith, some of whom had not come out in their own church. So these arguments against Christianity are quite old. They're not new. And what's surprising in some of these cases, particularly in Marty Sampson's case, where he says, why is the Bible so full of contradictions? It's interesting to me to see when you get into some of the atheist versus Christian debates, there are very, very basic arguments against the Christian position. The contradictions is a common one. The problem of evil is a big one, which he also references when he refers to 4 billion people being sent to wherever. I don't know if he's talking about hell. I don't know if he's talking about the Holocaust. I don't know what he's talking about there. But regardless, he's referring to the problem of evil. And there are some extremely high-level debates that go on between theologians and philosophers about, is the problem of evil a knockdown argument? What are the counter-arguments? And there's, of course, arguments in support of Christianity. And it's interesting to see people who've been in the faith for so long run across these arguments against the faith after 20 years of being in there and being persuaded by them as if it was the first time they've been exposed to them. So for maybe a word of advice to Christian friends and viewers, if you want your children and your acquaintances to to stay the faith, maybe don't protect them from these things, as many Christian parents are wont to do, to sort of hide them from the atheist positions. You should definitely don't throw them in the deep end and see if they swim. But and I'm sort of playing devil's advocate here because I myself am not a Christian, as we will be talking about shortly with an upcoming book. But for any position that you want to defend, protecting yourself from the arguments against it is only going to make them that more overwhelming when you finally and inevitably do run across them, as it seems both of these guys have been. But the main point I want to illustrate here, and where I think both of these guys go wrong in their statements, and this is a problem with living in a Christian culture, you don't see how deep the Christian values have affected your culture. And so Joshua Harris goes out of his way to point out the LGBTQ community and to talk about acceptance and marriage equality, and how he feels really apologetic. And he had this very interesting line in there about the importance of repentance and forgiveness and so on. And then, of course, Marty Sampson talks about this absolute love absolutely, forgive absolutely, and so on. Both of these sentiments are fundamentally Christian in nature. They are not. They may be departing the faith, but they aren't departing the value system that can only be justified by the beliefs in the faith. There is no explanation, no justification that I'm aware of for human equality, for example, outside of Christian theology. You have two arguments. First of all, imago Dei. Everyone is made in the image of God. It doesn't mean that we are equal in height or weight or intelligence or anything else like that. But it does mean that each of us are equal as bearers of this divine spark. We have a kind of moral equality, an equality in the eyes of God and relative to God. And secondly, related to that, we have original sin. All of us fall short. No one does good, not one, according to Romans and the Psalms. And no matter who you are, be you a borderline saint or a kiddie rapist, neither one of those is worse than the other in the eyes of God. Original sin separates absolutely, and that's why everyone needs Jesus. This is an extremely counterintuitive and, I would believe, extremely false moral belief. But it is a foundation of the theory of human equality upon which all of modern Western civilization hinges nowadays. And so when these guys make statements about forgiveness and marriage equality and these sorts of things, they're essentially criticizing Christianity from a Christian value set, except there is no theoretical basis anymore for that value set since they've departed the faith. But that is the case. You don't get modern progressive liberalism without Christianity. You don't get social justice without Christianity. It can't happen. All of the premises that modern liberals and progressives talk about from moral premises, ones which people like Marx, for example, did not share, by the way, about human equality, about their particular views, Rawlsian views of justice. All of these are fundamentally grounded in a Christian view of equality and the absoluteness of particular virtues, such as love, forgiveness, anything you see in the Sermon on the Mount. There's a passage, and I don't remember it off the top of my head, but where Paul says, against these things there is no law. because the Christian worldview holds that, the end is coming, the end of the world is coming, but even if it isn't immediate, life is short, and it's especially short relative to the afterlife. Where will you spend eternity? And so ultimately, the only thing that matters is your relationship with your Creator. And everything you do in this life is absolutely meaningless apart from its effect on that relationship that you have with God. So the love that you have for your spouse, if your spouse becomes a distraction from your love of God, then your spouse just became an idol, and you're committing idolatry, and you're increasing that separation from God. And this is why Paul tells his followers that if I wish you could all be like me, be celibate, be not married, but for those of you who can't control your sexual impulses, then it's better for you to get married. It's a fascinating passage. And of course, the flip side of that, in defense of Christian marriage, partially, is that if your love for your spouse, if you can love your spouse in such a way that you are loving God through your spouse, you're seeing God in your spouse and loving that aspect of them, then it is theologically justified and valid and good, and building your spiritual relationship with your Creator. But it's never anything direct. It's all about what happens after you die. And you see that same absoluteness, that same, except they view it in a historical rather than an eschatological perspective, but that same kind of absoluteness and virtue in a lot of liberals. This is always wrong. This is absolutely right. This is good. This is always bad, and so forth. Where in reality, morality is always contextual, which is not to say that it is relative, and we can get into relative versus objective versus subjective morality at another time. I actually do believe in real and absolute evil. I don't believe in absolute or objective good, which may sound like an odd thing, but for those of you who are interested in that, you can read the book that's coming out, Holy Nihilism, which I will be publishing either by the end of this month or at the very beginning of the next. And I think it will, my hope is that, first of all, I have an argument against the truth of Christianity. And so for those of you who are interested in that, it's already up on my channel elsewhere. It's the disontological argument, although I make it in a much better form in the book than I do off the cuff on video. But my hope was that in writing this book, for Christians who are not persuaded of the untruth of Christianity, the theological sections will actually help you become a better Christian. Because I am all about authenticity and integrity and living with purpose, as Rick Warren might say. So if you are a Christian, I hope that you will be the best Christian you can be. But if, like Marty Sampson or Joshua Harris, you are beginning to have doubts, as I did, and if you are beginning to be convinced that this faith is actually not true, and in fact, most of the people who claim to believe it's true don't care about the truth at all, and it feels like a big lie, like you're in a matrix where no one cares about the truth. The temptation is to swing hard left and go the opposite way. And the problem with that is that Christianity has appropriated credit for a lot of things that it did not invent. And it has taken in a lot of very good values and claimed them as their own. And so running away and rejecting some of these, or running into the opposite direction, saying, oh, progressivism, LGBTQ, blah, 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 equality. First of all, that's not necessarily departing Christianity. It's not departing from the belief in the truth of Christianity, even if you think you have departed part of the truth of Christianity, because these values have no justification outside of Christian theology. And second of all, there is a risk of there's a risk of not throwing away things that you should get rid of. But secondly, there's a risk of throwing away things that you shouldn't get rid of. I have come to believe that Christianity is, at its core, essentially anti-family. And Mormonism gets a pass on that. Mormonism is not included in that. This sounds highly counterintuitive, because culturally speaking, Christianity is strongly pro-family. In America, in the Western world generally, Christianity appears to be very supportive of the nuclear family. You have an entire radio show called Focus on the Family, one of the most prominent Christian broadcasting networks out there. How can we believe that Christianity is anti-family? Again, this is something to read about in the upcoming book, Holy Nihilism. But if you were to depart from Christianity and to see this association, think I'm done with the family business too, that would be a huge loss, I think, because family is a critical component, not just of our emotional and psychological well-being, but it's a part of our identity. Our family composes a part of who we are, biologically speaking, and the people who are the happiest and who live the longest in so-called blue zones around the world are the ones who live in intergenerationally connected, not nuclear families, but extended families, in fact. A digression, but so don't throw the baby out with the bathwater for Christians who are departing the faith, but also don't hold on to values that derive from Christianity. Because once you lose that faith, there's a whole lot of values and assumptions that are built off of beliefs that have become so accepted in the culture that it's not easy always to see the connection and the theological source to those. So it can be a little overwhelming at first once you begin to see this. But it can also be exciting. There's a great danger in stagnating intellectually as you get older. I'm just passing that age where people begin to become set in their ways and don't progress further in their own emotional and intellectual growth. I think that's a tragedy. I think learning can be a lifelong thing. At some point you're fighting against biology to maintain that, but it's always a good goal to strive for. And losing your faith, one of the interesting things that you can see in both of these statements is how surprised they are at how good they feel about leaving the faith. And of course they would be expecting to feel bad, because Christianity teaches that all happiness and all meaning and purpose and so on comes from God. And so when they depart faith, at first, their faith is in doubt. They're like, I'm really not sure about this. And that fence-sitting, not really sure position can feel a little stressful. But once you finally admit it, and you're like, yeah, no, I just don't believe. I don't feel like garbage anymore. What is this? And then that reinforces the fact that God is not, in fact, the source of psychological well-being and happiness and health and so on. And then you become more confident in yourself, and it's a liberating experience for many people. And so those are my thoughts on these two. It'll be interesting to see what comes of these. And it is a little sad to see them, depart from the faith, but without seeing the connections, basically carrying on with the worst byproducts of Christianity, while in some ways rejecting the best parts, especially in Joshua Harris's case with his divorce, which is very unfortunate. So, anyways, thank you for listening, and keep an eye out for the book. I will post more information on this channel when that actually does get published.